Good afternoon and welcome to the Southwest Creative Technology Network's Autumn Data Talks. My name is Melissa Blackburn and I'm one of the Watershed's producers. And as many of you will know, the Southwest Creative Technology Network is funded by Research England's Connecting Capability Fund and is a project which aims to increase the use of creative technologies across the Southwest. We are a partnership between the University of the West of England, the University of Plymouth, Falmouth University, Bath Spa University, Watershed here in Bristol, and Collider in Exeter. And since 2018, the network has offered 3 one-year funded programs around the theme of immersion, automation, and data. And this year, 2020, this crazy old year, is our year of thinking about data. In April this year, just as lockdown kicked in, we welcomed 24 new data fellows who have been doing some amazing research around data. And we're just about to welcome 8 new prototype teams who are doing some prototyping around data. The data fellows in particular have been thinking about data ethics and rights, inclusion and intersectionality, and the nexus between data and creative technology. And we realised it would be great to share some of the learning with our whole network. So this autumn, we're putting on these data talks, which will focus on data and social and racial inequality, reflecting the fact that data AI and the place of the human within it are such pressing topics at the moment. And for our second talk, I'm delighted to say that Dr Francesca Sobande is joining us to talk about data, race, and the marketplace. Francesca is a lecturer in digital media studies at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University. She is course director for the BA Media Journalism and Culture programme. Her work particularly focuses on digital culture, Black identity, diaspora, feminism, celebrity, the creative and cultural industries, and popular culture. She's an affiliate of the Data Justice Lab, which I can highly recommend, and is communication co-chair with Nia Jones of the Race in the Marketplace Research Network. And she's also just published a really exciting new book, which is called The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, published by Palgrave. In her talk, Francesca will be asking how issues regarding data and oppression are shaped by racial capitalism and the racist nature of marketplace dynamics. The session deals with questions and considerations concerning relationship with data, structural racism, and marketplace processes. So, slight content warning, we will be talking about racism and its effects. So just before we start, I wanted to let you know that there'll be a Q&A at the end, with the talk running roughly to 30 minutes. If you want to ask questions, please pop them in the chat. Fern will be drumming up questions from you and I'll pick them out afterwards to ask Francesca. For now, it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Francesca.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this talk today. I've really been looking forward to this and I hope that some of what I have to share will be helpful. So a little bit more about my work. And my work also addresses different issues to do with woke washing, which relates to how brands attempt to use representations and rhetoric associated with Black social justice activism and feminism, but to frame themselves as being woke. So that's to frame themselves as being invested in tackling structural inequalities, but in ways that are ultimately rooted in their pursuit of profit and which involves brands completely misrepresenting liberationist politics. Drawing on some of my ongoing research and ideas today, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on dynamics concerning data and commodification processes. So how are issues regarding data and oppression shaped by racial capitalism and the racist nature of marketplace dynamics? In what ways do data collection and construction processes contribute to the maintenance of structural oppression? Where is the human or humanity in data analysis? This session deals with questions and considerations concerning the relationship between data, structural racism, and the marketplace. I'm conscious that many of you may be familiar with some of what I discussed today, So at times, I may cover ground that you're well aware of. However, I think that today is a good chance for us to have some useful and generative discussions about data and connected questions to do with race in the marketplace, including in ways that account for underexplored elements of the role of racial capitalism in the creation and analysis of data. So I'm hopefully going to talk for around 30 to 35 minutes, and that should leave a good amount of time for any questions and any comments that you might want to share. Before I speak more specifically about the relationship between data, race, and the marketplace, I want to open the session by highlighting several questions that I find helpful to continue to consider when dealing with the notion of data, and many associated ethical issues and dilemmas. Some of these questions may seem fairly rudimentary, but before we start to think about the nuances of data, race, and the marketplace, it's necessary to unpack what data is. For these reasons, when conceptualizing data and considering your experience of using it or being involved in data collection processes, I asked you to consider the following questions. What is data? Who defines what data is? How do they define what data is and why? How is it created and collected? So that's thinking about epistemological, ontological, and methodological questions, and the process involved in the social transformation of something or someone who becomes viewed as a data point in a specific context. What isn't data? Does everything have the potential to be a form of data? What distinguishes data from other entities and ideas, and why? Where is the human and humanity in data? How is data shaped by social positionality, and whose humanity is most likely to be acknowledged and respected in ways that involves their life being treated with care and consideration? Is data ever more than information? If so, how? And in what ways do ideas about and experiences of race and racism impact understandings and analysis of data? And lastly, how does the commercialization of data relate to matters pertaining to race and racism? I may not have answers to all of these questions today, but my hope is that by the end of this talk, you'll have a more critically informed understanding of how the creation and analysis of data can function in society in ways that reflect and reinforce forms of racism and intersecting oppression. Furthermore, I hope that some of the questions that I articulate today spark more questions that can help us to grapple with seldom addressed problems to do with data and the inherently racist foundations that many so-called data collection and analysis processes are tethered to. To me, data is not something that already exists out there and is waiting to be gathered. Rather, something or someone becomes framed as data through various research-related processes that involve the social transformation of existing information and entities into what is then referred to as data. This point of view is one that we can discuss and debate. Is data created and used as part of your own work? Perhaps the word data alone does not sufficiently capture what you will be looking at and exploring. Are there particular critical theoretical or applied frameworks that you're working with? And if so, how do these inform your perception of what data is and how it should be handled, so to speak? Does your work involve treating people as data points? Are you keen to ensure when working with data as part of your own research projects that you avoid doing so in an oppressive way? What are some of the measures that you might put into place in an attempt to ensure this? These are other questions that can be helpful to consider if you haven't already done so. So the starting point from which I attempt to understand the power relations and violent forms of oppression that can underpin data is a starting point based on the notion that data is socially constructed and that anything's status as data can be contested and is typically contingent upon alleged authorities or institutions' perceptions of what constitutes data. For example, although we aren't data, our existence may be analysed in ways that reduces the complexities of who we are and how we live to reductive data points that are shaped by racist market logics that propel the demand for certain types of data. So data to me is simultaneously inherently fluid and fragile due to its socially constructed nature. Yet it is also often framed as being fixed and factual due to the ways that what is referred to as data is commonly presented as being an undisputable fact. In other words, there can be a duality to data that is scarcely examined in ways that make visible the contradictions at its core, and which expose how, due to racism and intersecting oppressions, some people are more likely to be treated in dehumanizing ways as part of data collection and analysis processes than others. Is the concept of data at odds with the concept of care? What would a society free from data look like and feel like? The notion of data is so closely tied to many notions of knowledge that to question the benefit of data may be to be perceived as being anti-intellectual. However, I ask these questions about imagining a life without data, not to dismiss knowledge, but to consider how knowledge can be produced and fathomed in a manner that is not dependent on data collection and analysis processes, which are part of projects that seek to quantify lives in ultimately oppressive ways. So data is never neutral. Put briefly, data is never neutral. What is constructed and classed as data, who analyzes it, who is analyzed as data, and how such data is presented and used to support particular actions, often generates insights regarding societal power dynamics and the politics surrounding data creation. For example, I've watched the various ways that data about Black people is narrativized and weaponized to uphold innately anti-Black perspectives and to justify inaction or gross actions that will negatively impact Black people. One of many examples of this is how Black people being disproportionately impacted by coronavirus is sometimes framed in ways that maintain anti-Black, bioessentialist ideas about the physiology and makeup of Black people, and in ways that involves dismissing how societal inequalities, including medical anti-Black racism, mean that Black people are less likely to receive adequate healthcare and support than non-Black people, which can contribute to the likelihood of them not surviving the virus. Data is never neutral and is never disconnected from the realities of racism. From the design of data collection processes to the editorialized narratives that may surround the so-called data that is yielded, data is always political and politicized. If we accept that data is never neutral, what does that mean for our use or rejection of terms such as objective and valid? When we closely inspect how something or someone comes to be known as data, why, who positions it or them as such, and what the impact of this is, it becomes apparent that in order for something to become societally viewed as a form of data, various hierarchical power relations are mobilized, which involve certain people being more likely to be regarded as researchers, knowledge producers, and authorities in comparison to others. An example of data that is far from neutral is how data about train fare evasion is generated in ways that can involve information about the racial and ethnic background of individuals being recorded, as well as perceptions of their gender identity. I've mentioned this example based on one of my own experiences a few years ago. I was on a train, I lost the ticket during the journey, I got off the train, and I wasn't able to get through the barrier. I then found myself being stopped by a rail staff member who I saw began to record information about me on a device concerning my racial and ethnic background, as well as my gender identity, all without asking me related questions or indicating that they were creating this data. I also noticed that some of this information appeared to be based on predetermined racial and ethnic category options, which were very problematic to say the least. This is just one of numerous experiences that raises various issues and questions concerning data, consent, ethics, and how data is constructed and collected in ways shaped by bias. In this case, in ways that can contribute to who is most likely to be penalized and profiled concerning train fare evasion. Another example of how data is not neutral is the use of social group categories that can homogenize very different identities and experiences, sometimes in ways that enable institutions to conceal the true extent of the absence of certain demographics within them. Regarding matters to do with race, ethnicity, and inequalities in organizational contexts, often when organizations conduct a self-audit to identify the demographics of their overall staff body, they are more likely to make use of all-encompassing categories such as Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, BAME, than specific disaggregated ones. This can be a way to avoid drawing attention to the lack of staff from particular backgrounds, and such an approach can result in what I deem to be conveniently opaque data. When speaking about geographies of racial capitalism, scholar and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore has stated that the relationship between slavery and race, race and unfreedom, and freedom and labor is one that we constantly try to untangle, and at our peril, we ignore it. But also at our peril, we make it too simplistic. When offering examples of how racial capitalism manifests today, Gilmore refers to how capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. When we recognize the intrinsically racist nature of capitalism, which is built on the oppression of Black and racialized people, then we find that our understanding of data operates in a very different way. We find that our understanding of how data operates in marketplace settings becomes sensitive to how racism is implicated in this. For example, the business of equality, diversity, and inclusion, EDI data, can be a lucrative one that involves some organizations attempting to produce and spin data that suggests they are more diverse and inclusive than they actually are. This can be a way to manage their brand image and potentially even access funds that are ring-fenced for organizations that are thought to be doing a good job at tackling inequalities. Data can become or be treated as a commodity or currency, including as part of the work of commercial organizations that are seeking to be seen as anti-racist and invested in dismantling intersecting oppression, but whose track record and focus on profit over the lives of people tells a very different story. Few organizations are prepared to reckon with questions and ethical issues to do with data bias, racial capitalism, and the way that they create and conduct research. However, we can and should do things differently, including by highlighting and pushing against how data is operationalized in ways that serve to sustain inequalities. So what is data bias? There are many different answers to this question, but a few answers we can explore include how bias is encoded in a data creation and collection process, how a data creation and collection process is significantly shaped by structural inequalities and power dynamics, without researchers behind the process accounting for this and attempting to address it, the coded gaze, which is a crucial term developed by Joy Balmini and which refers to algorithmic bias and gender and racial biases in AI and facial recognition tech. It's a term that refers to how these biases can result in creating exclusionary experiences and discriminatory practices. And the Algorithmic Justice League does fantastic work around all of this. Vital work that I always encourage people to read if they haven't already includes Safia Imogen-Noble's research on algorithms of oppression, how search engines reinforce racism, as well as Ruha Benjamin's work on race after technology, abolitionist tools for the new Jim Code, which in Benjamin's words, brilliantly examines how different forms of coded inequality take shape, and presents a case for understanding race itself as a kind of tool, as Benjamin puts it, one designed to stratify and sanctify social injustice as part of the architecture of everyday life. Data bias issues reflect many social hierarchies that relate to who in society tends to be treated as the norm that is taken into consideration and prioritized when different products, services, processes, and systems are designed, versus who's treated as the odd and ostracized other. Data bias issues are also connected to how research and innovation processes are designed. In addition to how data is selectively presented or represented in strategic ways that enable certain stories to be told and supported, and others to remain hidden and undermined. Data bias can involve forms of cherry picking that result in an intentionally incomplete picture that serves a particular political purpose. And the term bias is used to encompass a wide range of different issues related to oppression, prejudice, and discrimination. When referring to data bias, it is important to specify what biases are being discussed and what their impact is on data creation, collection, and analysis. In a similar way to how the words equality, diversity, and inclusion can be used to mask specific forms of oppression and inequality, use of the word bias without precision when naming what types of bias are being discussed can unhelpfully omit important information. Factors that contribute to data bias include the following: lack of examining how predetermined ideas, biases, and socio-political positions impact how data creation and collection processes are designed, trying to devise a universal data creation and collection process, but without accounting for differences between people and places, such as by claiming to have created an AI process that recognizes and is in the interest of all people equally. And other factors include, or other examples include, rolling out a data creation and collection process in a way that results in a relatively small and specific sample, but which is then claimed to yield universal and generalizable results. I also want to flag that the business of unconscious bias training is one that has rapidly expanded in recent years. But it is important to move beyond discussion of bias being unconscious and to consider what it means when forms of bias and power dynamics are known and actively obscured as part of data creation, collection, and analysis processes. So perhaps as part of your own projects, it can be good to have a clear plan that involves following several steps to try to mitigate data bias. For some, keeping an autoethnographic research diary of self-reflections may play a central role in that, as well as being upfront about crucial principles that underpin your work and how you approach data as part of it. Reflections throughout your research process may include thinking about at what point does something or someone start to be recognized or recorded as data? How are you involved in this? And how is this linked to different matters concerning privacy and public visibility, as well as race and racism? Other questions that may be relevant to your own projects if you're working on some include, how can we understand people, politics, places, power, and processes with the use of digital methods? What challenges and opportunities can be involved in digital methodological approaches? What connections and disconnections are there between various forms of online and offline activity and existence? How does your project, including any data that is part of it, linked to different types of discourse, different reoccurring discussions, communication, public dialogue, and debate about specific topics, and which may involve promoting and/or challenging different socio-political positions and institutions? If your project involves analysing digital discourse that is constructed and communicated through and across different digital platforms, how might you account for the ways that digital spaces and the discussions that occur within them are influenced by algorithms and how people attempt to curate their digital experiences? In some ways, my hope is that by the end of this talk, you will have more questions that lead to even more questions than answers. So distinguishing between anecdotal and data. Often so-called anecdotal information is regarded as being the direct opposition or indirect opposition of valued and valid data. But is data different to anecdotal information? Or is the difference one that is socially constructed? As part of Black feminist collaborative work with Chris Osai, who is a PhD researcher at Goldsmiths and works at Central St. Martin's, as well as London College of Fashion, and drawing on the Black feminist work of Patricia Hill Collins, we argue that the notion of objectivity is based upon white Eurocentric masculinist conceptualizations of knowledge production, which are dismissive of knowledge anchored in the lived experiences of Black people, and upholds an assumed irreconcilable distinction between what is referred to as data and knowledge and what is often referred to or dismissed as anecdotal. So as part of your own projects, whether you pursue some form of alleged objectivity or not, it may be beneficial to think about how objectivity is typically defined and understood, who defines it and why. Commonly, subjectivity in academia and many research domains is considered the antithesis of objectivity, and typically many researchers are discouraged from embracing and articulating their subjectivity as part of their work. How do your projects wrestle with similar issues? Or are you now just starting to think about some of them? For me, rather than performing a false distance between me and my work, I find it more helpful to dedicate time to reflecting on how who I am and my experience of the world informs what I do and how I approach it. Similarly, rather than accepting data as objective fact, it is beneficial to inquire about and question how data has been constructed and analysed, and to explore how these different processes may reveal just as much about social and political issues and subjectivities as the so-called data itself. So returning to thinking about what data is. Now, as I wrap up this talk, I want you to return to really thinking about these different questions. What is data? Who defines what data is? How do they define what data is and why? How is it created and collected? So that's thinking about epistemological, ontological, and methodological questions, and different processes involved in the social transformation of something or someone who becomes viewed as a data point in a specific context. What isn't data? Does everything have the potential to be a form of data? What distinguishes data from other entities and why? Where is the human or the humanity in data? How is data shaped by social positionality, and whose humanity is most likely to be acknowledged and respected in ways that involves their life being treated with care and consideration? Is data more than information? If so, how? And in what ways do ideas about and experiences of race and racism impact understandings and the analysis of data? And finally, how does the commercialization of data relate to matters pertaining to race and racism? Thank you very much for taking the time to engage with my thoughts and work today. And thank you for everybody who has made this possible and supported this event. I'm looking forward to any questions, and I know that we now have a good amount of time to address them. Thank you. Melissa, I think you're on mute.
Every time, every single time. So I just wanted to thank Francesca for a wonderful talk. That was really fascinating. There's a lot to think about there and a lot of questions to ask. We've had Francesca talk to our data fellowship in the last few months, and they kind of blew the tops of their heads off because there was so much to think about. It's very dense, but it's also really inspiring. And I know that some of the ideas in what Francesca is talking about here have really changed the way that some of our fellows approach their work. So this is really important stuff. So thank you again, Francesca, because you've had a great influence on our fellowship already. There are some lovely comments coming up in the chat. Joyanne's saying that she loves the idea of a bias journal. Could you unpack the idea of a bias journal a little bit more? Because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate that question, and also the fantastic work that Joyanne is doing as well, looking at different issues to do with anti-Blackness and colorism, various digital spaces, how algorithms are implicated in this. And for me, I think a bias journal, or perhaps a digital or algorithmic journal, could involve reflecting on some of the ways we see platforms tell us what they think they know about us. So something I've been monitoring quite closely is the promoted content that appears on my Twitter timeline, and what that is saying to me in terms of how these different platforms and organizations seem to understand me or frame me as a source of data. So I think self-reflection can take many forms. I like to do creative writing and drawing and different forms of creative practice as part of this. I enjoy exploring how we can think of these things visually, but also just monitoring the different ways that platforms are pushing certain narratives or certain pieces of content our way, and having a think about what that maybe tells us about the way the platform is operating, and these tensions between our ability or inability to create our experience and manage the way that the platform is responding to us or trying to encourage us to do certain things or look at certain things.
It's very powerful, isn't it? And I suppose that goes alongside this idea of data objectivity, which you talked about really clearly in that talk. How is objectivity defined, and the fact that the way that it's defined dismisses the lived experiences of Black people. Can you give me some examples of that? She said, putting Francesca on the spot, because that's quite an interesting aspect of this, isn't it?
Sure. So I think for me, it's maybe less about specific examples and more about both how objectivity is defined and what is regarded as objective. And I think this impacts so many different people who are marginalized for multiple reasons related to intersecting forms of oppression. And even in recent weeks, when we see what is regarded as political or subjective or an opinion and something to avoid expressing, as opposed to what we are told is fact, is truth, cannot be challenged, it will always be a matter of politics for me. So the minute somebody claims that something is neutral, I ask myself, why are they claiming that? How are they determining that? And who are they saying has produced this potentially objective piece of work or analysis? And I always remind people that even when individuals think that the influence of subjectivity is removed from a research process, as long as people are involved, so are social views, so are attitudes, so are personal experiences. So even when we're dealing with technology, as the work of people such as Safia Omojanobo and Ruha Benjamin really highlights, there are inequalities that are encoded into the design of these technologies and how these processes work. And for me, as soon as I hear the mention of objectivity, I will always start to think about what is this wider social or political project that this so-called objective work seems to be in support of.
And obviously that goes for both sides of all arguments, and we've really seen that this nail-biting couple of weeks. I was also really struck by the way that digital experiences are affected by algorithms, and we all know this, but again, this is something that we're all beginning to kind of only just be aware of. Can you unpack that a bit for me as well, because you mentioned that in the middle of your talk?
Yes, I think there are many fantastic people, especially Black women, doing work around algorithms and their oppressive nature, as I've highlighted in the talk. And I'm also aware that, you know, the fellows who are doing such brilliant projects. But something that I've been thinking about as part of my teaching and with my students is the different ways that algorithms can sometimes seem to be helpful on the surface to a certain extent in various contexts. So there are times when maybe creators who are wanting to share their work online and reach a particular audience, they might see there are moments when algorithms can result in recommended content, which increases the visibility of what they're doing. But what we always come back to is how, you know, depending on who is involved in the process and depending on the organization that these algorithms are a part of, it's highly unlikely they're going to be functioning in ways that are in the interest of many people, and certainly not those who are most marginalized in society. So this real challenge in terms of how much control do we have over our digital experiences, over what we're seeing, over what we're sharing even, and thinking about examples such as forms of shadow banning on Instagram, whose content is most likely to be censored and removed and erased. And again, what that then tells us about who is regarded as the norm in society and whose existence or embodiment is regarded as this other that is often very much demonized and associated with a lot of moral panic in society.
Thank you. That's a really powerful way of putting it. What else have we got? I was also thinking about one of our fellows actually, who is working on an intersectional data union actually, and really thinking about using the idea of a data union to sort of combat these kinds of prejudices and inbuilt bias. Is data union something that you've come across? Is it something that you teach your students about?
So it's not something that I've done much work on at all myself. So the last thing I'm going to do is attempt to speak on something that's out with my area of expertise. But I think that all the different projects that are coming through right now are really encouraging in terms of dealing with questions to do with data literacy and digital literacy and media literacy. And I think we are seeing more discussions at different levels of education that involves questioning the ways that digital technology can ultimately function as part of how inequality is sustained, as opposed to remedying inequalities.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's really exciting. And I think we've really found that in the fellowship, that we started off in one place, and then suddenly as people's consciousness kind of widened, they realised that there might be solutions to that. Someone else is saying, what are your thoughts on Twitter recently flagging content as possibly misleading? Do you feel this is helpful?
So I was just having a conversation about this during a seminar shortly before this. And I think, as you can tell, I suppose I approach everything with maybe a healthy dose of cynicism. I think these things can be helpful if they are applied to content that is absolutely putting forward misinformation and is inaccurate. But how often do we see things flagged this way? How consistent a process will this be? And to what extent, beyond highlighting that something is misleading or is putting forward a false narrative, beyond that, what's going to be done next? Because what's tricky is there's a question around, again, whose content is most likely to be deleted and actually removed and censored, as opposed to sitting alongside a post that encourages people to engage with it more critically.
And perhaps there is a place where, as people become more data literate and they become more algorithm technology literate, they see that flagging as a form of oppression in itself, obviously, and that becomes very, very difficult in terms of objective truth, which we've already discussed. It has been quite a weird couple of weeks in that way, and obviously there are certain things that we all want to believe, and then we have to question our own deep biases. Where am I? Here I am in the Q&A. So I'm thinking about people and humanity in particular. The humanity in data is something that has been a big theme across this fellowship, and it's something that Natalie Jemaya talked about in her last talk as well. How important is it to see data points, let me put that another way, to see people when we're talking about data?
So
that's a very question. I think
I was just thinking about, well, this question that I try and pose, where is the human or humanity in data? And I think when I'm asking that, I'm not necessarily implying that we should see the human and whatever we understand to be humanity there. But I think what does worry me is when the specifics of someone's life, the specifics of who they are, becomes a form of data that ultimately actually detracts from a helpful understanding of an issue that research is meant to address. So I think sometimes organizations pass off data that has really flattened the complex nature of what they're looking at. They pass that off as representing the entirety of a human's experience, or they pass that off as telling us a lot about a person who relates to this data. But I wonder and worry, to what extent is a lot of data really a reflection of people's lives, a reflection of ideas to do with what it means to be or to be viewed as a human. And I think not always, but many times we see data being used as part of narrativized stories and editorialized takes that are very much not for the lives of people and are pushing in a direction that involves a lot of questions to do with ethics, to do with the notion of human rights, and to do with how data and the use of it is a part of these problems.
Exactly, and we're in the middle of a great data story, aren't we? In the middle of a pandemic, which has been dataized up to its eyeballs, and we all feel like we have a handle on that data, and yet we're being fed data that we don't have a handle on. And I think in particular, we're growing a nation of young people who have a much better understanding of data now, which is something that you must experience in your work. What are their concerns with your students who are undergraduates? What are their concerns when they're thinking about these issues?
So I think to maybe take it to even a different level of education, I think what's encouraging for me is to see more conversations happening at different school levels to do with, again, digital literacy and data and media literacy. And I think concerns that I see shared by people from different backgrounds and different generations relate to what extent we can ever really know the data that exists out there that is meant to relate to who we are. So how much information have we inadvertently communicated, or even how much have we been monitored? Has our visible presence online resulted in the creation of data, the construction of data, and then how are ideas to do with what is or isn't objective or valid a part of that? So I think there are lots of concerns to do with how can you protect yourself in terms of the data you might be inadvertently generating, or what you might be doing that is then transformed into data. And also, I think there are lots of examples of people really wanting to disengage from different digital spaces and platforms in a way that's partly informed by their understanding of the risks and the ways that data is often used as part of political work that pushes a narrative presented as objective, but is so far from it.
Exactly, that is really interesting. It's something that that is exactly what we've really noticed, and that trend, particularly with the way that people are beginning to disengage with those platforms. That's as creative technologists, that's really interesting, and also maybe not such a bad thing. We've got another thing in the chat that says, loving this talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Francesca. If there's any examples of great uses of data that really serve in communities and hold person-centered experiences to the fore. So what are the examples of great uses of data that serve communities and hold person-centered experiences at the fore? That's a great question.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's maybe more examples of who's doing that sort of work. So grassroots organizers, individuals who rarely receive the sort of financial and institutional support that commercial entities do. And I think for me, when I do these sorts of talks, people might have questions around, am I anti-data? And am I saying there can never be any such thing as a fact? And I always feel that this is meant to be a bit more of a provocation. And in a way, for me, it's questioning our use of these terms and the language that surrounds it. So what we understand as being data may be referred to as something very different by another person. And a lot of the work that I find to be encouraging and community-oriented and collective-oriented, I think typically involves a critical approach to data and perhaps referring to experiences and knowledge in a more holistic way that involves less of an emphasis on quantification that can sometimes be a part of the oppressive uses of data that exists right now.
That's great. And we're asking that question because that's something that we're really grappling with at the moment in our own work, and how we use data in order to move forward intersectional practice and that kind of thing. I think this is probably going to be our last question today. What are your projections of the future? Big question, Francesca. What are your projections of the future? Do you think there will ever be what we would call data equality? Big.
My projections for the future. I mean, anything seems possible sometimes these days, but I think we'll see even more examples of people really disengaging from digital platforms, digital spaces, and the creation of new platforms as well. I think data equality, I struggle with the concept right now because of how I feel about the way data is often created. But something I will say actually in relation to that is when data creation or collection and analysis processes are designed, something that I think people often get wrong isn't the word, but people often don't think about in the way that I'd like to see them doing, is how imposing very fixed category options as part of surveys and questionnaires and refusing to allow people to self-define and communicate who they are on their own terms is definitely very much a part of the inequalities that are entangled with data, how it's made, how it's used. So maybe in the future, as well as seeing more people move away or unplug or critically mobilize as part of collective work that really, pushes against the ways we see data used right now, I think we will hopefully see more research processes that create more scope for people to self-define and to ensure that we are not looking at data or creating data that we claim tells an accurate story about an experience or about a demographic, but which is really filtered through the gaze of the researcher and actually has denied those people who are part of that group the opportunity to express what they wanted to in the way that they wanted to.
And that nuance is is the exciting future, hopefully, if we're being positive. I think I'm going to wrap up now, Francesca, because we've asked a lot of questions, and that was a really, really rich talk. I'm just going to go back to my notes and say that I wanted to thank everyone for coming. And I wanted to tell you that a recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. You can follow what our data fellows and our new data prototype fellows, who'll be up soon, are doing if you go to www.swctn.org.uk/data. And our next data talk will be on the 10th of December, when Professor Teresa Dillon will be talking about facial recognition and data and the history of that. Do join us for that. She is a wonderful speaker. And all that remains for me is to thank the wonderful Dr. Francesca Sobande again for a wonderful talk. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you all again here next month.